A few years ago, I was a bartender at Hooters. I worked until close most nights, which was at 1 a.m., and I would usually get out around 2. There was a Waffle House down the road that I would frequently stop at to eat after my shift. I was a recognizable regular because of my Hooters uniform, so I was well known among the staff. However, I never thought that I would owe them much more than a check for dinner. But one night, that changed forever. At about 9 p.m., a man sat down at the bar and ordered his first drink. He had an off-putting vibe, but far from the worst I've seen. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was checking me out whenever my back was turned. He stayed there for hours and ordered several drinks. During that entire time, nobody showed up to sit with him, and he made no effort to socialize with the other patrons at the bar. A minute before close, he finished his last drink and left without tipping. An hour later, I was freed from my shift and walked into the parking lot. I noticed a windowless white van parked in the lot. I knew it didn't belong to any of my coworkers, and all the customers should have been long gone. It gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't stick around to find out why. I made it to my car and drove down to the Waffle House for the meal I had been looking forward to all night. I walked in and sat down on my usual spot by the window. I made small talk with the waiter, but I didn't order. He knew exactly what I wanted, and so did the cook, who started making my food as soon as I walked in. Within a few minutes, I was served my meal, hot and fresh. I inhaled it ravenously. I hadn't eaten since I left the apartment. It was a while before I slowed down to take a breath, but when I did, I saw something that instantly made my stomach shrivel up. Out in the parking lot, just a few spaces from my car, was the exact same windowless white van I saw in the Hooters parking lot. I hadn't noticed it until then, but it was backed in and facing the restaurant, seemingly looking right at me. Suddenly, my food didn't taste good at all. I had a terrible feeling about that van. I tried to finish my food, but I lost my appetite. I waited for 15 minutes to see if the person in the van would get out to sit inside or pick up an order, but they never did. Finally, I decided I needed to get home, so I got up to pay. At the register, I asked the waiter to watch out for me as I left to make sure I got in my car. He had no problem with that. I left the restaurant and rushed to my car, then quickly pulled out of the lot. When I looked into my rearview mirror, I saw to my horror that the van had pulled out behind me. Terrified, I took the first turn I could. The van followed once again. At that moment, I knew I was being followed. I couldn't go home, but I couldn't drive around aimlessly trying to lose him and end up in a dead end somewhere. At first, I panicked. I just kept taking turn after turn, and each time the van followed me. Finally, I figured it out. I suddenly jerked my car into a random driveway without signaling. Then I backed out and turned around. Of course, the van pulled the same maneuver. I gunned it back to the Waffle House where I parked right in front of the door. Then I hurried inside. I got my first look at the man in the van as he got out and followed me in. I sat down in a booth by the kitchen and faced the door. The man who was following me sat in the booth next to mine and faced me, smiling at my panic and fear like the sick freak he was. The waiter came to me first, probably already aware that something was wrong. "Well, you're back early. You forget something?"
I came back for seconds. Could I borrow a pen?
"Sure thing." I grabbed the pen and frantically wrote a message on a napkin. I wrote that the man was following me and to call the police. I handed it to the waiter and he didn't miss a beat. "So you'll have the usual again?"
Yes, thank you.
"All right, let me get that started. I'll be right with you in 1 second, sir." The waiter walked to the phone and quietly called the police. Then he came back to take the creep's order. Then, it was just a waiting game. But I knew that was a bad thing. In the small town where I'm from, the police only care about speeding tickets. Their response time is abysmal, which gave the creep plenty of time to try talking to me.
"So, you work at Hooters, huh?"
Yes, I do. You're very observant.
"Oh, yes. And I like what I'm observing right now."
Thanks.
"How do you like your eggs?"
Scrambled?
No. You gotta get them over easy. I love watching them pop and ooze when all the liquid runs down those soft, white curves.
Sir, I'm trying to have a meal in peace.
Listen to me! You're gonna be in pieces unless you get in my car and come home with me, you understand?
From that moment on, I was unable to speak. Our food came out a few minutes later. I couldn't eat a single bite. I watched the man in front of me devour his plate without taking his eyes off me for a second. The wait seemed endless. The waiter came and took the creep's plate away, and it was still another 10 minutes before the police finally made it. And when they arrived, it was just a single deputy. He sauntered over to the waiter. As I watched the two of them talk, I couldn't hear them, but I could tell that the deputy was annoyed by the situation, as if concern for my safety was beneath him. In fact, he shrugged. Then he sat down on the other side of the restaurant and waved the waiter over so he could place an order. I was furious. I don't think the creep even noticed him. The waiter was the only one who did anything. He cashed the creep out at the table, and then to my surprise, he started to shout at him to get out. The creep resisted, but after a brief shouting match, he left the restaurant, got in his van, and waited for me. The waiter told me that he would go with me and make sure I wasn't followed. Together we went outside and I rushed into my car, shaking like a leaf. The waiter stood in front of the van, blocking him from getting out of the spot unless he wanted to run him over. Thanks to him, I was able to get home safely. It was a week or so before I had the courage to go back, but when I did, everything seemed fine. In the years since, I haven't seen that sicko once. I had asked the waiter what he said or did to drive him away, but he said he didn't want to talk about it, in a tone that let me know he never would. To this day, I owe a lot to the staff of that Waffle House, especially that waiter. If I had driven straight home from work, I don't know what would have happened to me. That waiter saved my life and spared me unimaginable suffering. Yet what infuriates me to no end is how that cop didn't even seem to care. It baffles me that I can rely on a waiter at Waffle House to keep me safe more than a cop.